So I've got an update on a couple of community-based programs to share with you, and one case I want to talk about that's currently we're currently prosecuting, have charged, but it's a great example of our community-based prosecution model and intelligence-focused prosecution working to identify the full scope of someone's criminal conduct to seek the best resolution, and not just to deal with that particular case, but to also try to improve public safety in the community. And then I'll take your questions. First, I want to go to the next slide. And there we go. I want to highlight that we've just concluded our almost 4-month-long Don't Leave Me Behind awareness campaign, reminding our community not to leave a child or pet behind in a parked car. And thanks to our partnership with Arizona Humane Society, Phoenix Children's Hospital, along with Penguin Air and Plumbing, we went through that entire campaign and we did not have one fatality of either a child or a pet due to vehicular heat stroke. That was our goal at the outset, to get back to where we were the previous summer past. 2 years ago, we went an entire summer with no vehicular heat stroke deaths, which was the first time we'd done that in anybody's recent memory. Last year, unfortunately, we had 2 fatalities near the end of that campaign, and so this year we wanted to have an increased focus on awareness and education to prevent what is an easily preventable tragedy. In comparison, nationally, there have been 39 children to die from vehicular heat stroke, whereas the average has been 34 per year nationally. Because of our extreme weather conditions here, the large expanse of Maricopa County, various opportunities where something like this could happen, we decided to undertake that extended effort. And again, I want to thank our partners, the Arizona Humane Society, Phoenix Children's Hospital, and Penguin Air and Plumbing, for contributing resources to help us expand the scope of the program. We also utilized digital billboards. We had some shopping malls also assist with raising awareness. And so, again, we want to thank everyone for their participation, for their partnership in having another summer back to where we want to be, of 0 fatalities. We did have one close call in July. Our 4-year-old boy had been left in a parked car at Lake Pleasant, but fortunately we had a good Samaritan who was aware of the change in law that allows someone to take action to rescue a child or a pet in a car, and they performed those safety measures and waited on hand for an emergency responder to arrive. The child was fine, but that was a great example of someone taking action, utilizing a change in the law, and ensuring that we stayed at 0. Now, while the campaign itself has ended, there are still a few more weeks officially left for summer, and who knows, we could have another week or another weekend where we see extreme temperatures. So we want everyone to continue to remain aware of what can happen with extreme weather circumstances and children and pets in cars, and just don't do it. Don't leave them behind. And it would bear mentioning too about watching children around water, given the fact that we still do have some warm days ahead of us, and to be careful and avoid a senseless tragedy there too. Next, for our Friday night football patrol, that's underway. There we go. That's the slide I wanted for our vehicular heat stroke. But for our drug-free pledge, we kicked that off a couple of weeks ago. We've already had 3 games, and this effort is in partnership with KISS FM, 104.7, iHeartMedia, and the Arizona Milk Producers and the Arizona State Fair. We'll visit 10 high school football games throughout the county in order to encourage students to sign the drug-free pledge in order to be drug and alcohol-free and avoid the abuse of prescription medication. And on game day, we've got MCAO staff volunteers who will visit high schools during the lunch hour and have kids sign the pledge then. And then we come back in the evening for the football game itself, continue to take pledges up until the end of the first half. Then we draw 2 students, one to receive a $300 cash gift card donated by the Arizona Milk Producers, and then a VIP package to the Arizona State Fair provided by the Arizona State Fair folks. Now, our kickoff itself a couple of weeks ago received the second highest number of pledges in program history. Over 1,400 students signed that pledge. And our most recent game at Valley Vista and Surprise We had over 2,000 students sign the pledge during lunch, which was almost the entire student body. It was a phenomenal turnout. There were over 150 student volunteers that included their varsity football team, their cheerleading squad, and student council representatives. So it was a tremendous effort. And then we were out there at night for the game, and I think we signed up the rest of the student body. It was a terrific turnout. The next Friday night football patrol is this coming Friday at Desert Vista High School in Phoenix. We've been there in the past, but it's time to go back and take advantage of educating sophomores and freshmen who weren't around the last time we were there and continue to try to reinforce that drug-free environment. You can visit our safeteensaz.org website for this year's schedule and to get current updates on the program. Next, I want to mention the case of State v. Albert De La Torre. Last name is spelled Torre. Currently charged with 4 counts of third-degree burglary and 1 count of attempted third-degree burglary in connection with a series of ATM burglaries across the West Valley. For background, between June 22nd and June 29th, ATM kiosks were removed from their locations in 3 different areas of the West Valley. Law enforcement in each area began their own independent investigation, and each separately identified Albert De La Torre as a possible burglary suspect. The defendant was arrested on July 30th in an unrelated case, and when he first went before a judge, he was originally facing charges in just that one case. So his release conditions did not include a bond. However, before he could actually be released, a detective investigating one of the other burglaries alerted the prosecutor assigned to the case of potential additional crimes that he was being investigated for. Through that prosecutor's partnership then, as part of the community-based prosecution model with other West Valley law enforcement agencies, they were able to verify the suspect was potentially involved in those other ATM burglaries. Our crime analysts then, from our crime strategies unit, worked with prosecutors to put together more information for the court. And when De La Torre was then seen, based on additional information gathered, the full scope of his criminal activity being presented to the court, he did receive release conditions that included a court-imposed bond of $25,000. He remains in custody, and additional potential involvement is being investigated. And of course, the charges themselves are not evidence of guilt, and we would have to prove any charge beyond a reasonable doubt for a conviction. I want to mention briefly a Smart Justice report that was issued by the Arizona ACLU. And the report is similar to some others that focus on just one aspect of the criminal justice system. And while informative for that one narrow area of analysis, misses the context and also is a little bit short on accuracy with the numbers that are being cited. In particular, the report attempts to make drug possession offenses or drug trafficking offenses seem as if that's the greatest single offense for which people are incarcerated in prison. And the numbers just don't bear it out. If you look at the fiscal year 2018 report from the Arizona Department of Corrections looking at their entire inmate population, possession offenses make up less than 10% in total for that fiscal year. Trafficking offenses make up 11.9% of the prison total, and total marijuana offenses, both possession, which is 0.5%, and then trafficking, make up less than 3% of total offenses within the Arizona prison system. Yet, the report itself claims that drug trafficking offenses make up 14%. I don't know where they get the number. The raw numbers don't show that. Also, if you look at corrections at a glance for the entire year of 2017, January, the percentage of drug trafficking offenses was 14.1%. February is 14%, and it continued to trend downwards until the end of the year in December, where I think it was 12.6% at that particular point in time. So there's a problem with accuracy in citing that information. The report also fails to discuss the drug trafficking environment that we have in Arizona, where the most recent fiscal year report from Customs and Border Protection once again identifies Arizona as a main thoroughfare for drug trafficking. So it makes sense then that we would see a number of drug traffickers imprisoned for violations of state law because of the prevalence of that type of criminal activity. There also is no mention of the fact that while singling out the percentage of Latinos in the DOC population, that Arizona, from a national comparison, we have the third largest number of criminal aliens incarcerated in our prison, behind only Florida and Texas, and that our current prison population made up of criminal aliens is about 8.6% currently. If you take those percentages out, then relatively speaking, our percent of Latino inmates in DOC would drop markedly. Also, the report doesn't define how they assess violence. In fact, in one pie chart, which is at page 7 of the report, curiously enough, separates assault from other offenses pertaining to violence. Yet if you add just those two categories together at 47%, it's more than twice what the pie chart reflects as drug offenses, which conflates drug possession with drug trafficking. And again, because of Arizona's position along a relatively unsecure international border and the exploitation of the open desert for drug traffickers, that puts those figures into context, which is missing in the report. Now, that's not peculiar to the ACLU. It happens a lot when people look at Arizona criminal statistics and our prison population. There's almost never any correlation or effort to try to put it into context with the type of crimes that we see. And honestly, that's probably the biggest criticism of a lot of these reports, is that there isn't much in the way of analysis trying to understand the criminal threats that we have in Arizona, and then the policy approach that the state legislature has taken, and then the responsibility by law enforcement in enforcing those laws and conducting those investigations, where you see the policy and the criminal threat come together for what we're trying to do. There also is no discussion of the large number of deferred prosecution and diversion programs that are offered by prosecutors. I do agree with the report that we need to continue to develop those types of programs. In fact, initial numbers that we have in our felony pretrial intervention program shows great promise there. We're expanding that program. This past July was the third year that we've had that program in a pilot posture. And over those 3 years, with 262 people participating in it, at the 3-year mark, we've only had 14 people commit a new felony offense. So that shows tremendous promise in reducing recidivism, which I also agree with the report should be a focus of our criminal justice system. And I think the lofty goal of reducing our prison population by 50% is great. And I think that we probably could achieve that over time by focusing on recidivism reduction. And that can be done by enhancing substance abuse treatment for currently incarcerated inmates, and also enhancing recidivism reduction programs. So in those areas, I agree with the report's focus, but in an effort to try to force statistics into a narrative about drug offenses being the primary driver of incarcerated inmates, the numbers just don't add up.
Bill,
yeah.
Can I ask just for clarification? When
Sure.
you say that Arizona has the third largest criminal alien population now, are you saying that it is disproportionate to the general population of the state?
No. What I'm saying is that from a more recent Bureau of Justice Statistics report that looked at incarcerated populations around the country, next to Florida and Texas, the raw number of people who are incarcerated in our prison who are criminal aliens is the third largest.
Might we also have a larger number of larger alien population than many other states do?
Could be, we don't know. California might actually have a larger one.
I mean than others. But the other thing, are you implying that those criminal aliens are the bulk of the drug traffickers in prison?
No, they're about a third. In fact, the raw numbers, there are 33% of those incarcerated for drug trafficking as of July of this year are criminal aliens. And for July of this year, drug sales and drug trafficking inmates make up 11.5% of our overall prison population. Criminal aliens make up 8.6% of our prison population, and roughly one third of those are incarcerated for drug trafficking, and 1/3 of those incarcerated overall for drug sales and drug trafficking are criminal aliens. So I'm making no comparison to the broader population, just focusing on those. Okay. And that may be all I wanted to share directly. Give me just one second. Oh, so, and to, before I went off on that tangent, to reiterate then, Albert de la Torre is an example of us utilizing intelligence-focused prosecution, which involves information sharing with law enforcement, having prosecutors assigned to a specific geographic area, which allows us to maintain better working relationships with law enforcement, and that kind of crosstalk or information sharing among agencies for us to be able to focus on someone whose criminal activity spans jurisdictions and was having a significant impact on the community. One other case of community interest to mention too, the sentencing occurred on August 10th, but it involved 64-year-old defendant Richard Hamilton, spelled as it sounds, where between January of 2015 and November 2016, the defendant accessed two young victims through a family connection and engaged in multiple instances of sexual conduct with a minor and molestation of a child. He had been registered from a 2000 case involving the molestation of a teen girl that he had access to as a karate instructor, and he was found guilty by a jury on May 3rd, 2018. I highlight this because he was sentenced to 180 years for 2 counts of sexual conduct with a minor and 4 counts of molestation of a child. That underscores both the importance of listening to children when they report and our community's seriousness in holding these offenders accountable. That's what I wanted to specifically address. What questions do you have?
Mr. Montgomery,
Yeah.
Regarding the Mesa Police Department and recent investigations into excessive force, most recently the Robert Jackson case where Scottsdale Police investigated it, cleared the officers, and your office reviewed the case and agreed with that outcome, and now the FBI is coming in to investigate that case as well. So this makes a total of 4 Mesa Police Department cases that the FBI is looking into. Your reaction to the FBI stepping in?
Well, I think from the standpoint of us doing a criminal review, and one of those cases also involved a criminal prosecution that we engaged in, what we look at from a state crime level is different than what the FBI or the Department of Justice can look at from a federal civil rights standpoint. So much as just to speak about it generically, process-wise, we get a case submitted to us for a criminal review. We may find that that we don't have the evidence to meet the evidentiary thresholds to file a state criminal charge. Our determination of that is different than what any agency's internal review might be for their administrative process, and it also doesn't preclude a further review for a potential civil rights violation. So the fact that the FBI is looking at those particular cases, I think for the community of Mesa and for the police department, it's probably a good thing, so that everybody is aware that those matters have been looked at from every conceivable angle, and whatever actions need to be taken are taken.
So to clarify, Scottsdale and your office didn't find any criminal wrongdoing in those excessive force cases, but the FBI could find some kind of civil rights violations or other kind of civil violations against those same officers that would clear the criminal wrongdoing?
It's possible, and to clarify too, so in one case involving a 15-year-old armed robbery suspect, we reviewed that case. It was submitted for a review, and looking at all of the available video, witnesses, interviews to include interview of the suspect, there was no reasonable likelihood of a conviction. In fact, there was no evidence to establish that a crime had occurred in that instance. In the second case involving what I've been referencing as the apartment complex video, the case wasn't submitted to the office. Scottsdale Police did come to show why they weren't going to submit it, and there wasn't any additional evidence we could ask them to go review that would have justified specifically requesting a submittal to the office. So when that was reviewed, presented by Scottsdale Police to prosecutors, we understood their decision. We also understood that that case was going to be provided to Mesa, as well as the one with the armed robbery suspect, for an independent administrative review. And then now I'm aware that the FBI is looking at that for as part of a civil rights investigation too.
So basically, on these individual cases, you don't find state laws violated, but obviously the FBI is looking at pattern of practice. If they have
Correct, and they can do that in terms of looking at it from a federal standpoint.
And from a civil rights, which is a federal offense, not a
Correct.
state offense.
Correct.
Do you think that it will extend to other police departments? I mean, Phoenix shootings in the Phoenix Police Department are off the charts.
I don't.
We are like at 69 for the year, and you and I have talked about this in past years when 45 was a lot, and it's proportionately it's way more than New York, Chicago, and cities of a similar size like Philadelphia, Detroit, San Antonio. I mean, we are so far beyond what the police shootings in those officer-involved shootings in those communities.
Yeah, in the raw number that we're at now, right, it's above what we have averaged in the past, which is around 42 or 45 for us. And I know that Phoenix Police has commissioned a review of the shootings that they've had. What I can share with you, Mike, is that when we've looked at each one of those cases, that more than half of them, easily more than half, maybe about 2/3 even, have involved suspects who are armed and who drew down on officers. That's a difficult scenario to ask anyone than to not use force in response to that. And I know we've had a couple of recent shootings where that was the suspect's first act, which was to draw on an officer and fire. So I think having the Phoenix Police Department take a review of those cases is wise, because even if we're saying that the use of force in these instances is legally justified, there's a whole other dimension that any police department could look at in any given shooting to determine, well, what kind of tactics were employed, and was the use of force consistent with policy and with the training that had been provided. And I think it's always healthy for agencies to take a look at their training, to take a look at their tactics.
Isn't it also true that the police unions are putting pressure on the departments regarding these investigations?
I don't know about that. When we get the criminal investigation, it's completely separate from whatever internal affairs or administrative review that is done. So I can't comment on that.
It's my understanding that an investigator with your office goes to the actual scene of every officer-involved shooting in the county. Is that right? Or
It's actually a prosecutor. We have an on-call roster for prosecutors to respond to officer-involved shootings. That's part of our protocol that we exercise within the county with all of our agencies. And I would remind you that our protocol has actually been used as a basis for national recommendations for prosecution offices and agencies on how a prosecutor's office should partner with an agency in conducting these reviews to make sure that when you have an officer-involved shooting incident, then any subsequent investigation is thorough, timely, and independent for the prosecutor's review. So having one of our prosecutors respond to the scene is something that we do each and every time. There might be 1 in 100 where it doesn't happen, but that's the exception.
with the increase in number of officer shootings, has that taken a toll on your prosecutors? Have you noticed that you have to call more prosecutors in to work these types of cases?
We've got a pretty deep bench now, because over the years we've been training more prosecutors on being able to respond so we don't get to that situation. But we had one day this year where I think we had 4 or 5 prosecutors called out to various scenes. And we had more available. Thankfully, we didn't have any more shootings. But we haven't had a problem of not being able to respond from our end as part of the protocol.
As far as why we have such an increase, I know the police department is, there is a study going on, but I guess anecdotally, are you seeing a certain type of trend in these cases, whether it be the types of criminals that are involved?
You know, anecdotally, the only 2 themes that we've seen, one is more recently of people who are out on release and the resolution of their case is going to result in prison. And so we've got fugitive apprehension teams going out to effect an arrest warrant, and then the person that they're trying to arrest doesn't want to be arrested, and they're using weapons against police. Related to that is, again, anecdotally, and as we go along within the office, we're also, in addition to tracking some of the characteristics of the shootings and the numbers that we post on our website, We're also trying to track additional discrete circumstances that I've shared in the past, and we're seeing an increasing amount of suspects who have weapons. You know, every now and then we might have seen in the past someone who feigned like they actually had a weapon, but more and more we're seeing people armed with guns, handguns and rifles, and they're willing to use them, which puts police in a very difficult position. So those are if I was going to call out any two themes right now, without further analysis, those are the two things that have stood out to me.
Is it alarming to you, the increase? I know a lot of people in our community, a lot of viewers are almost getting desensitized to these shootings because we cover it so often and it's happening so often. Obviously, the police chief is alarmed at the increase. What are your thoughts on it?
As I mentioned earlier, I support the Phoenix Police Chief's interest in wanting to bring in an outside entity to review everything, because even if we get to a point where we say, all right, the prevailing factor here has been a suspect's willingness to use deadly force, which doesn't give law enforcement a lot of options. I think it still is a healthy review to take a look at the tactics that are being employed and the training that's being employed, just to make sure that that officers are being as safe as they can be, and that the community is as safe as it can be when these scenarios occur. So I think it's healthy for agencies to review. My biggest concern as a citizen in this community too, though, is the willingness of suspects to resort to deadly force at the first instance of contact. That's something that I don't think we've seen to this degree in the past, and that's one thing that I'm keeping an eye on too.
So just to clarify, is Phoenix at a record high at this point of officer-involved shootings?
I don't know. I haven't done the year-over-year comparison yet. We're already near, I think, a high over the last 8 years for the number of shootings that we've had. I'd like to see none for the rest of the year, but I don't usually do an agency-to-agency comparison mid-year.
And as far as the amount of time each investigation takes to clear, I mean, most of the time officers are cleared in these cases. What's the average amount of time that the prosecutors look into these officer-involved shootings? And why is it now that some agencies are telling us they can't release body cam video until your office is finished with the investigation?
Our target is to have everything done within 6 months. And I would say that the situation involving the apartment video is a good illustration that video was widely available. It was originally in possession of a third party, and it gives a particular angle and a particular view of what happens. And a lot of people drew conclusions from that. And it's only with being able to look at the other 8 body camera videos and put everything together once the investigation was complete, to include interviews of the officers, that we're able to come to a better understanding of what happened. And the piecemeal release of video can harm the ability to present a total investigation to the public and explain things. I think as we see with increasing prevalence of video, and we see with an increasing prevalence of officer-involved shootings, that the community wants us to get it right, and they want to know what's going on. And I think the best way to do that is when you have a complete investigation and we can answer all of the questions that the community might have. So it's a sensitivity to wanting to maintain the integrity of the investigation. If we're going to charge a case, wanting to make sure that we're looking out for the due process rights of a defendant. This by no means, and look, we're at a friction point between the media's desire to get information and the prosecution and law enforcement's duties and responsibilities for criminal investigations. This isn't meant to be a clash between due process, ethical rules, and the First Amendment. It plays out that way sometimes. But Nicole, what I want you to understand, and Mike and everybody in the media, this is not an effort to control information or to exert some degree of authority over a process, but it's an effort to want to make sure that when we're looking at these circumstances and situations, that we can do so in a way that ultimately will maintain the public's confidence that everything has been looked at. And if we charge somebody with a crime, that it's because we have the evidence to do so. And if we're not going to, that it's because there are specific reasons that on the basis of the totality of an investigation, I can answer very pointed, fair, honest questions about why a decision was made and what evidence helped us get to that point.
Take that into consideration with last week, Glendale PD released a or 3 body cam videos of a man who was shot, who was trying to pull a weapon. It was clear to see that he was trying to pull a weapon. But the actions of the officers, having this guy who was pinned down, had 3 to 4 officers on him, pinning him down. And then when one of the officers felt something, he shot him point blank range in the head 3 times.
And if you're going to ask me about a particular case, you need to ask me ahead of time so I could have all that information available. That might be a good case for me to walk you through. But because we didn't know about it until just right now, I don't have anything to show you. So I can't walk you through the analysis right now.
What about people who think that, you know, a lot of viewers think that that being able to see the body cam video, you know, shortly after the actual incident is more an issue of being transparent, and that withholding the body cam video until after an investigation is completed is not really serving the purpose of being transparent, and how would simply showing that body cam video, which won't change if you show it before or after the investigation, change the outcome of the investigation?
I think with that particular question now, you're talking about timing.
Yes.
Not necessarily transparency itself, but just timing. I think a good example to point you to on that would have been the Mitch Brailsford case with a shooting that occurred there. And that one worked out in a process where we had judicial oversight and judicial review, but where a judge agreed as well that there were portions of that video that shouldn't be displayed until after it had been presented to a jury because of the graphic nature of it. And in that particular instance too, keep in mind that we also have statutes protecting victim privacy. So there could also be body camera video that might reflect or depict a victim, and they have privacy interests that they can assert within court that we all need to be mindful of too. And there also is prohibitions against even commenting on whether or not someone had confessed, let alone then display their confession. These are things that we're going to have to continue to work through. These issues aren't going away, and we're only going to have more video prevalent as agencies continue to roll it out. And it's a conversation that I'm more than willing to have because my oath of office doesn't allow me to carve out the First Amendment either. I need to be mindful of that too. But this is something that I think we're going to have to continue to work through, understanding what the media's interests are, what the community's wishes are, and then what law enforcement's responsibilities are too, and trying to mesh all of that together. And it's messy. And it's hard. If this were easy, we wouldn't be talking about it. We would have figured this out the first deployment of body camera videos. But it's something that we're still trying to work through. Okay. No other questions then. Thank you very much.